Okay, go ahead.
Good evening. Randy and I are grateful to be able to teach again tonight. I really appreciated what Randy did last week. And tonight's scriptures are really going to be a little challenging. Some of it's encouraging, but there are some challenging things. Get your heart ready to really be challenged in some things that you may need to make some changes. All of us do as well. Randy, why don't you start us with a prayer and we'll get going.
Sure. God, thanks so much for this time that we can look at your word. We appreciate the encouragement. We appreciate the challenges and just look forward to the things that JP is prepared to share with us and that you have prepared in your scriptures for us, and pray that we can take it to heart and put it into practice. We love you. Amen.
Thanks, Randy. Well, tonight we're going to be looking at 1 Peter chapter 2, starting with verse 4, where Randy left off. And we're going to go on to continue on with a section that goes to chapter 3, verse 7. So let's start with this first section about how does Peter describe us together as a church worldwide, really is what he's referring to, and because it's written to a group of people. But let's look at chapter 2 and verse 4. As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by men, but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. He's basically saying, that Jesus is the living stone, and we are also living stones, and that we're being built into a spiritual house. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit more about that principle in a little bit. But it is important to see that Jesus is a living stone, and he calls us also as living stones. But he also describes us in some other ways. Down in chapter verse 9, he says, but you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. He describes us really as a chosen people. The Israelites are a chosen people of God, and he says now, the Israelites didn't really live up to the plan that he had for them. And he says, now we as God's people and who've been born again and relationship with God, he says, we are now a chosen people. And he says a royal priesthood. It's not just a priesthood, but a royal priesthood. And I was looking at some of the thoughts about that. And, Jesus is a priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek was a king as well as a priest. And so we are of royal blood because we are the brothers of Jesus, who is royalty in spiritual case. I don't know if you want to make any comments along those lines, Randy, or not at this point.
Well, I think it's surprising when you read the Bible, not just here in 1 Peter, but in Hebrews and several other places, how often it talks about us being kind of in the same standing as Jesus in some respects. Obviously, we're not Jesus, but the idea of us being his brothers and being like him and him being the pattern for us. And, here it's interesting. He starts out saying, well, Jesus is a living stone and we too are living stones. So we're, again, the idea that we're like him.
Yes.
And even as you said, in something as unique as Jesus being both a king and a priest, he says we're given that standing as well. So it's really
the job of I'm sorry, go ahead.
To be talked about that way.
Yeah. Well, he calls us also a holy nation, a nation that's set apart. Again, kind of like a chosen people, but a nation that's set apart, holy to him, and a people belonging to God. And over in Exodus chapter 19, a lot of these same thoughts Jesus expressed to the Israelites. And he said, you know, if you keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession, even though I own everything. He says, even though I own everything on the earth, you will be my treasured possession. And I think, you know, that's just a great way to think about, again, how God looks at us. And Randy talked about, you know, that we are called the brothers of Jesus. And one of the things that Hebrews says is that he's not ashamed to call us his brothers. Because again, we are like that treasured possession. We are his brothers, and he's proud to call us that. I think that's just something that a lot of us need to remember, how God thinks of us. Any thoughts, Randy?
It just that it's a humbling thing to be talked about that way, because you know we're obviously in some ways so far removed from Jesus. It's almost embarrassing to be talked about that way sometimes, I think. But that's how God looks at us because of Jesus. So that's amazing.
Yeah, because of Jesus, not because of us.
Right.
And we remember our sins, but the Bible says, "I'll remember your sins no more." You know, I think that's just again the difference between what God can do and what we can do. In chapter 11, he calls us also. Let's look at this passage in verse 11. He says, calls us aliens and strangers. He says, "Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from the sinful desires which wage against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of being wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." And I think that several things about this passage. The fact that he calls us aliens and strangers makes me think about, even though the words in the Hebrew refer to people who were living there temporarily and then moving on, and some who settled in for a while. But I know that when he talk about aliens and strangers, is that, you know, a lot of people who come from other countries and come into the country, and whether they, let's just use an example, somebody comes in from Mexico or from South America, and they come and they live in their home, and they're trying to relate, but they really have a different culture at home, and they speak their native language at home, and even after a second generation, sometimes when maybe they grew up speaking English and doing very well, but when they go home to be with their parents, they again start speaking Spanish all the time, and bilingual. And so I think that one of the things about us as Christians, he says, in the world we're aliens and strangers. We have a different culture than the world, and even though they just use their sinful desire, use the desires of the fleshly desires, it calls it legally or technically, is that it really refers to the fact that we are different from the world, where a lot of people just say, well, that's just the way I am. We don't have that luxury to be able to say that's just the way I am, because we are to be different. We are different from the world, and we're not to give in to those desires. And living such a good life that people are going to be changed as a result of that, even though they may think of us being wrong, that they will see their good works and hopefully then become Christians so that they can then glorify God when he returns. Any thoughts you want to add, Randy, on to that?
One of the things that surprised me when I started studying the Bible, there are certain themes you see over and over again. And especially in the New Testament, there's really not, I mean, this theme of being a stranger in the world or being an alien, or this world not being where our home is, comes up over and over again. It's like this fundamental tension between us and the world. And the thing that surprised me as I've studied that over the years, and I think that we so often are fighting to feel normal, or to feel like everybody else, or to blend in, or to, you know, I mean, we spend a lot of time and energy trying to feel at home somewhere. And yet really the Bible the Bible calls us to accept the fact that our home is not in this world, and to even resist that idea that this world is where I belong.
Sure.
And that takes real work to do that, but that's a very persistent thing in the scriptures.
Yes, in fact, one of the things that I read about when it talked about strangers was about the fact that these were temporary residents, and even the aliens had a sense of being temporary residents in that place, and that's really the way that we are to be looking at ourselves, as just temporary residents here. This is really, like you said, not our home, not what we're made for, not what we're designed for, not for this life.
Yeah.
So, well, all of those great things depend on one very important principle. It depends on whether or not Jesus is our cornerstone. And here's a picture of a cornerstone at the bottom there. And you can see that everything, even though this is a very, very old building, this is part of what was left of the temple that was destroyed by the Romans. And you can see how even on the corners, how straight everything is, just lining up there to that corner. And that's really what we need to do, is that our job, if we're going to have these qualities in our life, we got to be in line with Jesus. We've got to line up, and he's the standard that we line up to. He's the standard that we have to imitate. He's the standard of what is right and how to live in this world. He's the one that we are to be lining up with. And even though it may go against our own nature, and it may certainly it goes against any society on the world. It doesn't matter what part of the world you live in, that it's going to go against the society. And so this cornerstone is a really important thing, and that's why Jesus says, "I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious stone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame." Again, you're trusting in that stone, and you're lining up with him as the cornerstone, other place it says it's built upon the apostles and the prophets, the foundation of the prophets, and so again, the law and the prophets. And so that's again the foundation, but the cornerstone is lined up just so perfectly so that the building, it supports the walls going in either direction, but particularly lining up in that corner there, and also down the wall as well. As a guy in construction, you probably have a few things to say about that, Randy.
It's a funny story. When I was many years ago, when I was in construction, I was on a job we don't really use cornerstones in construction anymore for that purpose now. But the cornerstone's main job was it was the reference point for everything in the building. And so all of your measurements were taken off the cornerstone. Well, I was on a job when I was much younger in construction where they got the wrong reference marks. And because they had the wrong reference marks, they got partway done with the building and realized that none of it fit the plans. And they actually had to tear down the building and start over.
Wow.
And because it was going to cost more to change it than it was to start over. And, I think that that's really what his call is here, is for us as people and as a church, is he's saying, look, what are your reference marks? What are you measuring off of to figure out whether you're building the right way? And I think that's a big challenge for us. I think a lot of times we're pulling our marks off the wrong reference points in life, or it's very easy to do that, whether it's as individuals or a church. And so I think that's what his whole point is with this cornerstone thing, is you got to reference everything to Jesus, or the building you end up with just isn't going to work.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. And I appreciate those comments. And that's a very, for your experience, it's a great comment there. Well, going through the next section, really, there's a big word that we're all going to have to understand. And it's repeated several times in the section we're about to get into. which is to submit yourselves. I'll tell you, if there's anything that goes against society and today's society, and if there's anything that people have a trouble with, whether even Christians and people just don't like the idea of submitting. And I think a lot of it has to do with a misunderstanding about what that really means. There's a way in which, for example, some things are subjected. God subjects all of the universe is subjected to Him, and it says it's awaiting for the revelation of us as His people, or the redemption of us as His people. And so there are certain things that are subjected, and caused to be submitted. But here it's a command for us to submit yourselves, is the way it's translated in the NIV. Some of it said, I like that because it indicates really what I think the meaning of the word really means when it's not. Let me just look at this next section here. The word for submit is hupotasso. That's the verb, and it of course has lots of different variations of that, but that's the root word. And it was as it says here, this was a word that was a Greek military term, and it meant to arrange a troop division in a military fashion under the command of a leader. And so there are some things that are subjected in that regard. But then it says in a non-military use, it was, and get this, a voluntary attitude of giving in, cooperating, assuming responsibility, and carrying a burden. Let me put this on the voluntary attitude of giving in. I think that's really what it means to be submissive and to really submit ourselves to the different things that we're going to be reading about. It's a voluntary attitude, and if we don't have the attitude and the voluntary side of it, and quite honestly, in some of those situations, we are having a voluntary attitude about something that we have been subjected to, and that's really the very first thing that we're going to look at. Let's start in verse 13 through verse 17. It says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake. In other words, because of your relationship with God, you're to have this attitude because of your relationship with God and for His sake, for His reputation, for His will to be done in our lives and the lives of others. He says, so submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether the king as a supreme authority or the governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. Show proper respect for everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God and honor the king. And later on, we're going to see that the church, Christians are going through persecutions, and a lot of times at the hands of the government. And so he's saying you need to submit yourselves even to a government that is even persecuting Christians. You want to have a good reputation. You want to have the right attitude about giving in, and so there's again, part of the difficulty that we have a lot of times is that we don't like what we're having to submit to. And in fact, I think the real issue is that we don't understand the voluntary nature and the willingness for the Lord's sake, to have that kind of attitude and to willingly submit. And yet, when it says that it's either obey God or men, again, we have to obey God, but it's not necessarily when the government may allow a lot of things that are not right, but we may still have our freedom to do things. Or again, they were being persecuted, and he says, just honor the king, and honor the king that isn't all that wonderful for your life in a lot of ways. And so this is a really challenging thing for a lot of people even today. And so he says, we need to submit for the Lord's sake to these sorts of things. And I think this is a difficult teaching for a lot of us. Randy, any thoughts along these lines? This is the very first one of these things we're going to look at.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things about that. I think this is a tough topic. I'm glad you got this chapter. But the thing I think about first off is just, I think I struggle with submission just like anybody else does, but they had such a difficult circumstance to submit in. There's nothing that I'm called to submit in that's anywhere near as difficult as what they were called to submit to. And God expected them to go through that and do that. And I think your point about you're doing it for the Lord's sake is really important. Because ultimately that's who we're submitting to in the end is God. And,
yes,
we're expecting him to take care of things. But what we're called to in these verses is difficult. And I think that sometimes we struggle with what we're called to submit to, but it helps me to realize that they were expected to submit to things that are much more difficult than what I'm asked to submit to.
Yeah, I was thinking also about the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, when he says, he says to pray for those, to love your enemies and to pray for those who persecute you. And then he also says, if someone comes to you and says, carry my pack for a mile, then say, okay, I'll do it for 2 miles. What kind of impact? What would that soldier be thinking about you when you said, oh, I'll do it. I'll do it for 2 miles. Well, what kind of impact would well, that's going to have a pretty big impact on the guy who's trying to make you, kowtow to him, and you say, oh, okay, I'll do it for 2 miles. That's what Jesus is saying, is that kind of attitude affects people. And It causes people like a centurion to come to Jesus and say, hey, I need help. A Roman soldier comes to Jesus. And so this is a kind of life that really stands out when we have that kind of spirit. So, and that's why he says, by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of other people. They'll think, oh, well, you guys are weird, but they cannot deny the quality of a good life.
So many of the hard things we're called to are things that lead people to ask, what makes you act that way?
Yes, exactly right. Yeah.
Exactly what God's intent is.
Yeah. Well, the next section is verse 18. Again, it says, submit yourselves to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it's commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because he is conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it, but you suffer for doing good and you endure it? This is commendable before God, because to this you were called, because Christ suffered for you. And then we're going to pick up on that here in a moment. Again, something very, very difficult. He does use a word here that is different, that is often used for slaves. He uses a word that many people say it refers to household servants. It has to do with people that are in the house or that are around them. I do remember Jesus telling about a parable about a man who was a slave and went out and worked in the field, and then he came in, and rather than sitting down to eat, he fixed the meal for his master, and then he was able to go ahead and eat. And his point was, after all of this, we've just really done our duty, And again, Jesus sets an example here, but again, he says, submit your masters with all respect. And it's easy to respect the masters that are good and considerate, but to do it with respect to those who are harsh, that's the real challenge. And he says again to submit with respect. Listen, if you submit with respect, even to a master that's harsh, it's less likely he will be harsh with you. I'm imagining, but who knows? Again, it's submitting. Here's the situation. Let's look at this. Slaves did not have a choice. They had no legal rights. There were 60 at the time of the writing of this. Everybody simply says there were 60 million slaves in the Roman Empire, from basically Spain all the way down to Egypt. 60 million slaves. Some of them were very educated and worked for their masters as lawyers and doctors and brought in income, but they had no rights, had no citizenship, all these different things. But yet, and so they really had no choice but to it was either obey this master, but the person is your master at this point. And he says, but to submit to them with all respect. And again, the voluntary surrender, it's the attitude that he's talking to them about. And I think that again, we tend to focus on the fact that there was no choice, but you have a choice. You may not always have a choice about the circumstances. You always have a choice about how you respond. And that's what Jesus is teaching here, or what Peter's teaching here. I'm sure you got some thoughts about this.
I think I'll save until later.
Okay.
You got lots of good stuff left, and time's going to get away. So
yeah.
I'll save.
Well, what I want us to look at really as the standard here is about Jesus. He says, even if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, it's commendable before God, because to this you were called. So again, unjust suffering, we don't like. We tend to think of why me, why the circumstance, why is it's not fair. We always like it's not fair, it's not right. And he says this is commendable if you suffer for doing good. And then look at what it says about Jesus. There are 4 things for us to think about. It says he committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. Jesus did not sin even when he was sinned against. And then it says in verse 23, it says, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. And so he held his tongue. There are lots of things he could have said. And in fact, God would have sent angels to save him if he just simply said, hey, come say, but he didn't retaliate. He didn't make threats. There are lots of things. And I think, again, you're going through something that's unjust, not retaliating, not making threats. This is the way of the world, is to retaliate when something's been wrong to us, is to retaliate, and also to make threats. That's the way of the world. And Jesus is saying, he has set an example again as the cornerstone, as the standard, as the what is the way in which we're to measure up to things. And then he says, he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He entrusted himself to God. So he knew that God was going to judge justly. It wasn't up to him at this point. And even though he prayed that it would be different, God said, and he said, I'm just trusting God, and I know he's going to be just. I know he's going to take care of things. And again, for him, it didn't happen right away. It didn't happen, and again, we tend to think of God's timing is different than our own. And so again, he didn't do that. But the other thing is, it says, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree so that we might die to sin and live for righteousness. By his wounds we've been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you've returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. What I'm thinking about that is that Jesus focused on the long game. He knew the purpose for what was happening. He knew, again, that God was in control. And as long as I know the long game, we're going to go through a lot of difficult things in our lives. And if we focus on the long game, if we focus on the fact that, we're not going to be here forever, and we are going to one day be with the Lord, as long as we, again, remain faithful to him and see Jesus as a standard. This is a high standard. This is a good mark for us to really follow. And when I think then about submission to the government and submission of slaves, again, you see the attitude of Jesus. They tried to get him to speak, tried to get him to sin, tried to get him to say things, and he just held his tongue. He didn't say anything until there was a legal requirement for him to say, I adjure you by the living God, are you the Son of God? And then he said yes. So that was it. But they tried to make him say all kinds of things, but he did not and would not. And so I think this is a tremendous passage that really is the standard. These four things, I think, really make a difference in our own life if we can follow this example of him when we're going through very difficult times, when unjust things are happening to us. Again, these are incredibly important points. I know you got some things you're thinking here.
Yeah, it's to me, this is kind of an extension of what we talked about last week when it said, "Be holy because I am holy," or "Be like God." And I think that it helps me a great deal when I remember that my entire hope is built on Jesus doing the things that we're being asked to do here. I mean, he had to submit. He had to submit to things that were unjust and unfair and go through all kinds of things for me to have a chance to have a relationship to God. And the humility that was involved in that, I mean, here's God himself taking that setting that example of submission and humility. And he was submitting to God, he was submitting to the government, he was submitting to unjust treatment. And yes, if he hadn't done all those things, I have no hope except for destruction. And so, being like God is not just a matter of me not giving into some particular sin. Holiness is bigger than that.
Yes.
It's to imitate his heart and the way that he did things. Yes. And that's a lot to ask, but he set us an example. And so me doing that is me showing Jesus to somebody else. Yes.
Well, and again, we go back to submission being an attitude, and that's really what you see in Jesus, is the right kind of attitude as well, and the way he responded. Well, we're going to close with this next section, which is, again, another difficult thing for people in chapter 3. But the key thing here, it says, wives, in the same way. In the same way what? Is the same way as Jesus would be doing things. Here's what again, the standard isn't, again, it says, be submissive to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe in the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. He's saying, again, if you're married to someone who's not a Christian, he said, again, submit to your husbands in the same way that Jesus would have done it. There may be some things that are going on where you're going to retaliate, you're going to speak up, we're going to, and he talks about later on, he shows something about your beauty shouldn't come from outward adornment, like braided hair and wearing gold jewelry and fine clothes. And we look at that and we're thinking, what? But what they were talking about was something a lot more ostentatious than what we generally think of when someone is wearing, a pearl necklace or a nice dress or something along those lines and nice hair. They're talking about something that was a lot more elaborate than what when we think of these particular items themselves, and a lot more where they showed all their jewelry and a lot of their gold being displayed and stuff. It said it should be that of your inner self in fading beauty, of a gentle and quiet spirit. The quiet, gentle, and the quiet is not speaking, but it's again the manner in which you speak. It's not out loud and obstreperous type of response to situations, and the unfading beauty of that. So basically, what you could say about your wives is that your submission in your life can have a powerful effect on your husband. It can make him change. And I told my wife at one point, I said, I think it took me about 6 years to become a good husband. And she said, no, it was more like 8. And but at the same, yeah. And Pat is not a loud or obstreperous woman, but she can be very gentle and like if I'm driving fast and the way that I shouldn't be driving or something like that, and at some point she may go, "You're driving too fast." I'm driving like, yeah, I have all these reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing, but then when she says, it's scaring me. Okay, now I understand. So can speak in a way that is very gentle, but can also be very powerful. And so it can have a big impact. And he says, even without words, because of your behavior, your wives. I'll think about a woman that Pat and I knew in Maryland, Kathy Tipman. She was converted here in Gainesville back way back in Crossroads days, and came to Maryland when we were there just for about a year or so. So she was with us for about 7 years. Her husband was not a Christian. He was in the Navy as an officer. Every Sunday morning before she'd go to church, he would say, why don't you not go to church today? And let's go to the officers club and have a brunch. And she would say, well, I would be happy to do that right after church, and we can go to lunch right after that. And she never did that. But she always had this, okay, we can do it later. And she didn't say no, she just said later. And he never became a Christian. We became really good friends and all kinds of things. But he moved to California, and out there he became a Christian. And one of the things he said was, if she had ever given in, I was doing it deliberately, but if she had ever given in, I would not have become a Christian. It was her quiet and gentle spirit. She wasn't obnoxious about it. She didn't say, why do you keep asking me this? She just said the same thing, for 7 years, almost 8, before he finally became a Christian. Again, her gentle response really had a big impact on him. Any thoughts, Randy, again?
Well, these verses sometimes get more attention than some of the other verses we've looked at, but it's really striking how much submission is just part of the Christian life, no matter who you are.
Yes.
There are so many people who are called to, and they're not even all mentioned in these verses. I mean, we're called to submit to leadership. We're called to submit to government. We're called to submit to each other. Submission is just our natural state as disciples, no matter who we are. And yes. So it's, it's not natural for us, but it's what God calls us to. There's none of us that don't have people we need to submit to, and probably lots of them. Even though we don't necessarily think about ourselves in those terms, I don't think it's normal for us, but it's normal for God. And so, that's the thing that jumps out at me, is being a disciple requires a lot of humility and a lot of practice at submission.
Yes. There's also one very important point mentioned. Let's just read the rest of this passage. It says, "For this is the way that the holy women in the past put their hope in God, used to make themselves beautiful. They were submissive to their husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her master." Some translations, her Lord. "You are her daughters if you do what is right." And look at this, "and do not give way to fear." I think fear about being abused, fear about what if he's wrong, fear, again, all kinds of things that brought about fear that cause us to not want to submit. And that's whether in any, like all the situations, all of us are being submissive in some way. But fear is the one thing that causes us to say, well, what about this? And we get fearful, again, rather than like Jesus, trusting God who judges justly. It isn't our time. It's our job to do what God has asked us to do. He takes care of the rest in his time, not in ours.
Mm-hmm.
So,
great stuff.
All right. Then the last thing, again, to husbands. Husbands, again, in the same way. In the same way. Wow. The wife has got to be like Jesus. The husband's got to be like Jesus. You're going to have to do the same thing. So be considerate as you live with your wife. The word considerate here means to live together with understanding, is the definition, or to be sensitive. I would say that this is something what is not natural to men, is to be sensitive and to be considerate. If he says, this is our job. Ephesians says to love your wives like Christ loved us, the church. Again, we have a difficult job as well. It's not easy. It's not natural. And I think there's a big difference between a Christian-based marriage and a traditional marriage. A lot of people think traditional marriage, where the husband is the master, ruler of the house. Again, she called him master. He did not act like master. I think that's the difference, is that someone can view you this way, but again, my wife respects me, but I do not act like I deserve that respect. I think so being considerate as you live with your wives, and then treat them with respect. Again, the word respect can be translated, and treat them with honor, or treat them with deference, as the weaker partner, and heirs with you of the gracious gift of life. Treat them, you honor your wives, it says honor them, and treat them with respect. Isn't that interesting? Using the same word that masters, or that slaves are to give to their masters, he says, that's the way I want you to love your wives, and I want you to respect them as the weaker partner. Well, how do you respect someone who's weaker than you? That just goes again. What he's saying is you treat them with respect as the weaker partners. And he's only talking about physically in that regard. And listen to this, and heirs with you as the gracious gift of life. They are co-heirs. They have just as much relationship with God as you have. You're co-heirs together with Christ if you're both Christians. And then it's this, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. How you respond to your wife or do not do these things affects your prayer life, which means that it affects your relationship with God.
Yep.
And I think that this is a especially important thing for men to realize. I think for women, it's also, again, not giving into fear, learning that submissive is a voluntary attitude, remembering always for the people submitting to the government, submitting to slaves, submitting to their masters, wives submitting to their husbands, husbands being considerate of the wife. All of this, again, is quite honestly, all of this is what makes whether or not we are really like Jesus, and whether or not, I think the implication is if we're not doing these kinds of things in our lives, then we just need to grow a lot in order to be a lot more like Jesus. None of these things are natural. They are the things that require the Holy Spirit. They're the things that require us to live the way that Jesus would have us to live. So, any closing thoughts here, Randy?
The last thing I would share is just the idea that even to the apostles who were going to lead the church, when Jesus talked to them about leadership and authority, he said, look, leadership isn't about lording it over people. If you're going to be a leader for me, it's going to mean you're a servant. And if you want to be first, you've got to be a slave to everyone. And so the whole thought process of leadership and submission and authority is kind of turned on its head in God's viewpoint. And so, I think it's that way, whether we're talking about this or the things we talked about earlier, and we need to live that way.
Yeah. This is what will make us stand out in the world. And like you said earlier, makes people wonder, why are you this way? How can you do that? And it gives us an opportunity to really share when we live the kind of life that really stands out. So, well, thanks again for all your thoughts, Randy. And again, thank you for taking the time to listen to us tonight.
Amen.
And we'll see you again next week as we look in chapters 3 and 4 to next week.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, JP.
Thanks.